What we're going to talk about now is the idea of shifting our demand curve. When we're talking about shifting demand and supply for that matter, there's a very important assumption that we take into account. That's called the ceteris paribus assumption. Ceteris paribus roughly translates to all other things being equal. This demand curve exists because of a very specific combination of variables. And these different variables, combined the way that they are, give us the demand curve in its present shape, its present form, like we see on the board. However, one of these variables could possibly change. And as one of these variables changes, so too will our demand curve. Now I want to point out something very important, and that is a shift in our demand curve does not occur because of a change in the price in our market. Here we see at price 1, the quantity demanded is low at Q1. If we are to change the price, our demand curve doesn't change at all. We just go to a different point on our demand curve, such as P2. At price 2, we see that the quantity demanded is larger. And that makes sense because as price falls, the quantity demanded is going to rise, going back to the law of demand. Well, that's all fine and dandy, but then what actually does shift our demand curve? There are going to be 5 different factors that shift demand curves. The first factor is a change in income. Remember that when we're looking at these supply and demand models, we're looking for an economy as a whole. So when we have some sort of change, that means that the average population is seeing this change. If there's an increase in income, we mean that there's an increase in the average income of a citizen. So what happens to a good like steak as our income rises? If you said that demand should increase, you're correct. What an increase in our demand curve actually means is that at any given price, the quantity demanded of steak is going to increase. We see on our original demand curve, at price 1, the quantity demanded is quite low. However, as our income increases, and so too does our demand for steak, we see that the quantity demanded at that price has increased. We also see that's true for other prices along our curves. What we see is that at any given price, now that our income has increased, quantity demanded has increased at any given price. But what about goods like ramen noodles or Spam? Goods that really aren't people's genuine favorite things, but they might buy them because they're cheap. So what is it that happens when we have a good that as we gain more income, we actually find that we demand less of that good at any given price? These goods are called inferior goods. They're goods that we consume when we have low income because they're cheap and because, hey, you know, we have to consume them. We need sustenance, so we need food. Ramen noodles, Spam will work to fill our bellies up. Perhaps we'll purchase store brand, generic brand clothing because it's cheaper. It's not glamorous, but we go ahead and we need clothing, so we're going to purchase these. So an inferior good, as our income increases, the demand is going to decrease. Again, what that means is that at any given price, the quantity demanded will go down. So there we see that at a specific price, the quantity demanded has actually decreased even though our income has gone up. Another factor that can shift demand curves would be a change in the composition of the population. This can be taken in countless different directions. We can compose the population in tons of different ways. For example, we could be taking a look at the percentage of youth versus the percentage of adults versus the percentage of elderly people. We could take it as the percentage of people living in rural areas versus suburban areas versus urban areas. We could think of it as a percentage of people with less than a high school education versus a high school education versus some college versus all college versus post-college. We could think of it as race, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander, and so on and so forth. When we're looking at the composition of the population, there are certain groups that are going to purchase certain goods and services more than the other groups. For example, the one I like to do is the adult diaper market. What we see here is the demand for adult diapers. What happens when the percentage of elderly people suddenly falls? If you said the demand curve would fall, would shift to the left, would decrease, all of those things are correct. That is very true. Elderly people are the main users of adult diapers. If a lot of elderly people suddenly die off, bing bang boom, demand shifts to the left. What happens at any given price? The quantity demanded of adult diapers will fall. Another factor that can shift demand curves are changing tastes. And of course, I'm not talking about your taste buds. I'm talking about what's cool, what's hip, what's trendy, what's happening, what's now. When those things change, people change their habits. People strive to be, trendy or cool. So what we can see is, let's take a look at the market for disco music. In the 1960s, disco was starting to get into its groove, into its flow. People were interested in it. However, in the 1970s, disco became extremely popular. People were more interested in picking up disco records, going out to the discotheque and boogieing all night long. People liked disco. Therefore, at any given price of disco music, they were going to demand a larger quantity. However, then the 80s came along, and what happened to the popularity of disco? It decreased, so that at any given price, the quantity demanded decreased. And we see this happening with all sorts of trends, with all sorts of what's cool now. As people's tastes change, that's going to lead to a change in the demand curve. The idea behind it is, if we like something more, it's now giving us more utility per unit, and therefore we're going to be willing to pay a higher price for it. We're going to want to consume more of it. Our fourth factor in what can shift demand curves are changes in expectations about future conditions and prices. Now, prior to this recording, this past week, we had Death Storm 2011. The big snowstorm happened, came around on Wednesday, a whole bunch of snow fell. Earlier in the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, stores were packed. People knew there was a forecast that there is a big snowstorm coming. It was going to drop about a foot of snow on us, and therefore you might take out some power, you never know. So therefore, to be prepared, they thought, let's stock up on batteries and canned goods and stuff like that. So when they saw that the snowstorm was coming, their expectations about the future changed. They said, we might need these batteries in the future. So what happens to demand? You're absolutely right. It shifts to the right. It increases. People want more batteries at any given price. We can also take a look at our expectations about future prices. I used to see a pattern. Every Thursday, prices for gas would shoot up. And over the next week, they'd slowly come down. What do you think this does, say, Monday or Tuesday, when I'm thinking about gasoline? Am I going to demand more gasoline at any given price on Monday or Tuesday, or less? On Tuesday, you're going to see that demand for gasoline, as long as other people have noticed this pattern as well, is going to increase. People are going to say, ooh, I know that gas prices are going to go up on Thursday, so I better get a hold of it now. On the other hand, what happens to the demand for gasoline on Thursday? After we actually see those prices have gone up, now we expect that over the next few days the prices are going to start coming down. What's going to happen to the demand curve for gasoline on Thursday? It's going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left because we have an expectation that in the future prices are going to be lower. So if I have that expectation, I'm not going to be as willing to purchase the gasoline right now. Our last factor that shifts demand curves are changes in the prices of related goods. Goods can be related in one of two ways. They can either be substitutes for one another, therefore they can replace each other to some extent, or they can be complements to one another. That means that they're often used together. Two goods that are a great example of complements to each other are hot dog buns and hot dogs. So let's take a look. What do you think is going to happen to the demand of hot dog buns if the price of hot dogs increases? Well, as the price of hot dogs increase, the quantity demanded of hot dogs are going to fall. If that's the case, less people are buying hot dogs. So are they going to need hot dog buns? No. The demand for hot dog buns will fall. If I'm not buying hot dogs at any given price for hot dog buns, I'm going to want less. Because really, what else are you going to use hot dog buns for? I'm not going to use it for a meatball sandwich. Forget about that. I'm going to use a good piece of bread for that. Something that actually goes well and makes the meatball sandwich better. Same with a hoagie. Same with a sub sandwich. I'm going to use a better type of bread for that because you know what? Why waste myself on a hot dog bun? We can also have substitute goods like Coke and Pepsi. What's going to happen to the demand for Pepsi when the price of Coke increases? People are going to want to get a hold of more Pepsi at any given price. If they're not drinking Coke and they still want some other delicious soda beverage, they say, I'm not buying Coke. The quantity demanded of Coke is going down because the prices have increased. I'm now more interested in entering the Pepsi market. I may not have been there before, but now I am, and therefore our demand curve shifts to the right. At any given price, there's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded for Pepsi.